Welcome to Character in Action with Matthew J. Norcross, the official podcast of the 7 Degrees of Change Foundation. Come journey with us on the real-life stories of character in action. And now here's your host, Matthew J. Norcross.
Welcome to Character in Action from the 7 Degrees of Change Foundation. I'm Matthew J. Norcross, here in the studio with my producer, Richard. Hey, Richard.
Hey, how it going?
Doing great. Now, if you didn't know, Richard, the 7 Degrees of Change Foundation was founded back in 2009 with me and 6 others, then high schoolers, to promote global literacy. And it all started with a mission trip to the Philippines to ship books to libraries to underserved communities. We've since shifted our focus to character education at 7 Degrees, but this week we're talking with Quintin Pastrana, who lives in the Philippines and is part of the Library Renewal Partnership, which has a similar mission to the one 7 Degrees was originally founded upon. In addition, he has over 20 years of leadership experience in the energy, natural resources, and development sectors. He was educated and trained at leading institutions in the United States, United Kingdom, and Asian Pacific as well. Quintin joins us now via Zoom. Quintin, thanks for being on Character in Action.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Richard, for having me, and hello to all your listeners and viewers.
Thank you so much. Now, before we get started, can you please tell us, our listeners, more about yourself?
Yeah, thanks. Just in a nutshell, building what you said, I came in from the private sector, but had some government work. And I think in between the two sectors, you realize there's a need for a third. And that is with what you can do with your private time and any of the resources you have left over from your earnings and savings. Why not pay forward with all the benefits you've gotten from a well-paying job and a good education? So on the civic side, I ended up putting up the Library Renewal Partnership 10 years ago. And thankfully, because of our partners, including your father and yourself and your mom with Phoenix and 7 Degrees, we were able to really expand our reach in terms of the communities that we support in terms of literacy and empowerment, not just in the Philippines, but also across Asia Pacific now. And we have libraries in Bhutan, for example. We have libraries in India, in Indonesia, in Cambodia, some parts of Southeast Asia. And recently, as of just about a week ago, we opened our most recent library in Spain, in Barcelona. So that's quite exciting, building on what we've done. And I do owe it to the experience I've had working with partners like 7 Degrees, and also the experience of working with communities to give them what they need. And the fundamental thing of everything is empowerment by education. So that's a focus I have on right now.
Yeah, it's a good focus, that's for sure. So how do you define character?
Yeah, that's a tough question, but I mean, I can say pretty much, and this is going to be a repetition of a theme, is that character is basically what's the bedrock of all your actions. It's a consistent thing that you have when somebody's looking or nobody's looking, and in public or private. And really, it's really the anchor of what makes you a person, and what makes you a person is not just the way you think, but what you're defined by what you do. The Greek philosopher Aristotle said it as much, that we become what we do, and excellence is therefore a habit. So I've taken that as my leading definition of character. It is the anchor in which every action, good or bad, stands on.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of guests say that on this show, right, Richard?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
That might be a universal, probably a universal truth.
Yeah. It's definitely a universal truth, that's for sure. So, if you don't mind, please tell us a story of witnessing either in person or in history. Someone that was a true phoenix, someone that was a role model who led by example and pretty much made the world a better place.
Yeah, thanks. And I'm glad to say that I've met a lot of them and read about a lot of them as well. So history's replete with characters, and heroes, men and women of different ages and different centuries who've really risen to the occasion and transcended themselves. But I mean, as we know, also it's one thing to have a public life and another to have a private life, and often the private life tends to overshadow the public life later on in history when we find out that they're not as advertised. You've seen it a lot, especially with some public figures. But so given that, I think the most consistent thing I've seen, and this is close to home, that I can truly vouch for, are within my family. My grandparents, for example, that one is, even after all these decades and years, I mean, their examples really has really shined or shown through. And that is, for example, on both sides of my family, my grandparents lived through the war. They were professionals, they were well educated, but they had to start from scratch after World War II. And it was a very, very great example of a partnership between, for example, the U.S. and the Philippines, wherein
Right.
we fought together in the war uh, against a common enemy. We had to rebuild the country, and at the end of the day, both were responsible for what we know now as there's the greatest generation in humankind, and that, I think, my grandparents on both sides were part of that, because they were part of rebuilding the country after World War II, and they had to restore their name, their fortunes, their resources, get educated some more, raise their families and build a country in the process. And one was a diplomat and a lawyer, and the other one, interesting enough, was a dentist, and both of them were supported. Both of them were supported equally by professional wives. My other grandmother was an entrepreneur and put my grandfather through dental school, and my other grandmother was a pharmacist, and she basically supported my grandfather through law school, and when he was a scholar at Georgetown. And the cost of living in DC in 1946 was just as expensive as it is now, in proportion. And so you look at those families who were great in terms of raising children, like my father, my mother, for example. And at the end of the day, they did that while creating what we know now as a post-war developed country like the Philippines, and as a great global partner with the U.S., which they also lived in. So I'm quite happy to say that there's nothing like looking at examples closer to home, because you can vouch for both their public and private lives, and that's an eternal example for everyone, regardless of whether or not you're a millennial or a Gen X or a post millennial or post Gen Z. I mean, those are shining examples for everyone.
Yeah, I think that's so important too, just because there does seem to be a trend, and I don't know if it's millennials or Gen Z, where it's more about the trauma that our parents made for us than talking about anything else. And it's okay. We can understand that maybe our parents were not perfect. I think everybody understands that, at least for themselves, to say they're not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But how long are we going to make the excuse about our character while blaming our parents? And so I think, like what you're saying, is just a good example of showing appreciation for the people who made you in some sense.
Oh, absolutely. And the kind of environment they grew up in, or they went through, right? War, after the war, there was very little technology, very few resources. They don't have as many things that we take for granted now. And yet they rose above and became better through those hardships. Whereas I think this generation has no excuse not to excel, because there's so many opportunities that were deprived from our parents and our grandparents.
Yeah, I agree. So let's move on. Please share a moment that stands out in your mind, something big or even the slightest gesture that was a transformative Phoenix moment for you, one where you knew you had a significant impact on someone's life or on a group of people.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's a great question, and there have been many, but I think the one that strikes close to home, and I think I'll rope your family in here as well, was we opened a library in one of the most depressed parts of the Philippines. Your dad was there with us. So Paul was there with us, and he had grown up in the Philippines as well, although in relative affluence, because he went to the international school, and I also went to private school. But we had chosen to open one of our first libraries in the most depressed area. If you Google the word Smoky Mountain, that used to be the largest dump site in Southeast Asia, because at that time, when the Philippines was in the 70s and 80s and we were under a dictatorship, there was a lot of public services weren't doing well, and poverty had gone up. And that was one of the leftovers from that dictatorship, is that you were looking at a place where people were born in, and couldn't get out of. There was cycle of poverty was so bad because there were so many there was a lack of opportunities around the country. People would go to Manila, and there was no place to live, so they had to live near the dump site and work in that dump site. And that was one of the most densely populated areas in the country. And thankfully, over time, that had actually the poverty level was reduced. They were able to reform that place. But on the remaining communities there, the hundreds or so families that were there, they didn't have the basic services. So what your dad and I ended up doing was identifying a place, working with a local teacher, converting a small space into a library, and just to see the faces of the children when we brought in those picture books, which is where you start with, right? And then you get them growing into the more advanced texts with the help of teachers, with the help of good nutrition. And you notice that after that experience, we noticed that we'd come back, and your dad would come back like 6 months after, and we'd see that the progress was there, and they were actually taking care of themselves. They weren't asking for handouts. They were just giving us progress reports of how well they did, and they were doing well in school. And those kids right now, I mean, from then on, a lot of them are now scholars at university or having their jobs, and they've basically gotten out of that situation and community, but they now are continuing to give back. So I think that's an internal moment that keeps coming back to us. That happened many years ago, maybe over a decade ago now, and that's such a transformative moment because you can really see that immediate change in the kid's face or their parents' faces, that there is hope, and that hope isn't something that they were given as a dole out, but was actually something that was given them as a gift that they could use to improve their lives on their own.
I love that.
Yeah. I actually remember going to the Philippines to read those children's books that I helped develop. The Phoenix books.
You were there. You were there, exactly. I mean, and you'd seen the face, right? It was an oasis of hope in the middle of a very desperate community, right?
Right. Exactly. So let's move on to the trait of respect. And my question to you about this trait is, how do you think we can rekindle the trait of respect today?
Yeah, that's a fundamental question, and I think it's all the more necessary in these days where there's a lot of toxic dialogue out there. There's a lot of politics has gotten so infectious, and to the point that nobody can work or get along. And I think basic respect for humanity, regardless of what background you're at, is I think the fundamental thing, and that starts with respect for yourself, right? Knowing that
Right.
you have your own worth, and that someone who may have different political or social views from you can still be reasoned out with, even if you will never agree. At least you treat them with that sense of decency, and then move on. And I think that agreeing to disagree and moving on is such it's an art form these days, but there has to be a bit of sincerity in terms of treating somebody else's humanity, even if you won't fully agree with them, just to try to work on common ground. And sometimes you will find common ground, but if there's this fundamental belief that there's this other person has that sense of humanity that can probably transcend and work with you on certain issues, no matter how difficult it is, I think a lot of progress is based on that, because not everybody's the same. So I think that sense of decency on yourself and trying to find in other people that's where it starts.
Yeah, it does. Don't you agree, Richard?
Absolutely.
Yep. So now the second trait I want to talk to you about today is fairness. And my question to you about this one is, how would you define fairness, and how would you want people to demonstrate this trait in both their professional lives and their personal lives?
Yeah, that's another great question. It's funny because I've actually just completed a self-authoring course by Jordan Peterson. He's a great libertarian, and he talks, speaking about responsibility. He's one of these people who believe that at the end of the day, it's your individual responsibility that is your own, right? It's what defines society, if people are able to take care of themselves on their own, right? So I think fairness to me in that sense is, I think it's a phrase he uses as well, and he's corrected it, which is you want an equality of opportunity, not an equality of outcome. I'm such a big believer in that. My life is also defined by that. I think if people are given a fair shake to succeed without a guaranteed outcome, in the sense that you're doing it on the merits and you're doing it on the basis of your abilities, then I think that is fairness to me in action. I mean, fairness is a principle that you've heard about this, and I think I've had great conversation with your dad about this, about participation prizes are so passé. it really has to be, well, people are going to compete, people are going to win, people are going to lose, they're going to learn from that. And at the end of the day, all you want are a level playing field and a fairness of rules. But the outcome is really up to you. And I think that's I guess it's a more reasonable and centered version of fairness than the ones we were seeing out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I always think that, people who tend to think that they want the same outcome must be people that never won before. Because when you look at something like the finals or the championship or the FIFA Cup, something like that, I don't think anybody questions or gets angry the sense that every single team didn't get the championship, the ring or the trophy. It's like, it would be so weird if you won and you said, well, you know what? It doesn't matter that I won. Everybody's going to get this trophy. Then it's like, well, what's the value of the trophy now?
Yeah, exactly.
And so just being able to, like you're saying, it's so important that people can have the opportunity to play. But once we start to try to legislate or configure a situation where everybody wins, in some sense, everybody loses.
Yeah. So I think I meant to ask about responsibility, but moved on to fairness by accident. But I'm gonna talk about responsibility this time. So from your perspective as someone who promotes global literacy, what does responsibility mean to you?
Yeah, that's that question has a couple of layers to it, I think, and one of the layers is it's the responsibility of being a good example, because there's no point in trying to help people if they can't, they can't rely on you to deliver what you say you're going to deliver. So that is a constant thing. Everybody's human. We all fail sometimes, but because you are, I guess, in the business or in the service of helping others, you have to hold yourself to a higher standard. So that personal responsibility of being a good example, it's second to none. I mean, you have to do that, because otherwise you lose your credibility. And so it's about helping yourself first. So if I'm assuming my material needs, which is why I have a day job, if I take care of my needs, I can take care of other person's needs better. And that helps me also impart the example that, well, you're going to have to take care of yourself as well before you take care of other people. So that tends to be infectious in that sense, if they see that you're doing exactly what you're preaching. So I think responsibility starts with self-mastery, and from self-mastery comes a good example that other people can hold on to and then and maybe learn from.
Yeah. What's your response, Richard?
I actually, in some sense, feel like I have more of a question.
Sure.
When I was told that, we started teaching people how to read and making that something really important kind of later in human history, to where eventually, I guess, public education and things like that is the reason why we are structured to think that everyone should learn how to read. Is that actually true? Is reading a fundamental human right, or is it a privilege? Because I'm thinking, when you're doing global literacy, in some sense, we're trying to get books to people who don't have them.
Exactly.
Should
we be responsible for that?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that might have to do with the idea of respect, which you talked about earlier, and then fairness too. It's the idea that you kind of feel in your gut anyway. It's hard to explain, but the idea that we've been given a lot of opportunity and resource. We were born with opportunities, and unfortunately, in the world there are other people who don't have it, right? So it still plays into that message I sent earlier about equality of opportunity. It's fine, right? But not everything is a level playing field. So there's some who really need that step up just to get them on a level playing field. And in this case, for example, in areas in the Philippines where they don't have as many, or Southeast Asia or India or whatnot, you'll have areas that really didn't have that fair shake. So I think that responsibility comes in, or that respect comes in, wherein if you realize they don't have a leg up, we're not trying to subsidize everything, right?
Right.
We're just trying to get them to a point where they can decide for themselves. And the reading bit is the first start. I mean, nutrition, reading, everything the Maslow hierarchy of needs is, for as long as they have that bottom set of fundamental resources, then I think you can do a laissez-faire and hands off and say, okay, my responsibility is more or less done. But in areas where there's a lot of poverty, I think we still have that responsibility for those areas, and it only goes so far, right? But there's a bit I think that we need to do, especially once you feel in your gut that you go to these communities, as like for example, Matt went into the Philippines, and you could tell that if they were left to their devices, if they were left to the current local governments, for example, that help would be few and far between, or long in coming. And if it wasn't for a small intervention like putting up a little library there with a local teacher, then I don't think we would have gotten the same results.
Yeah, I think that's just so amazing when people take on that type of responsibility instead of governments.
Yeah.
I guess that's why I even asked, because I just understand in America there's almost this demand that we have people teach our children and teach everyone how to read. And then when I hear you talk about your project, I'm like, it seems so much different, because you're personally with a team taking an investment in people that you care about and do your part and be responsible in your way to help all of these people. And if maybe we in America did that more and took the responsibility on ourselves, maybe we wouldn't have such a issue with education right now.
Yeah. So let's move on to the trait of caring. And my question to you is, what does caring mean to you, especially bringing books to libraries to those in need?
Yeah, I was educated in Jesuit education, in a Jesuit institution, and there's a Latin phrase that said "cura personalis." I think that's the root of the caring word, which is care for the whole person. And I think that's really what it feels like when you see someone who doesn't have the opportunity for you. I mean, you're not guaranteeing incomes or jobs or their future, but you're guaranteeing them an opportunity to have that. You realize that that lack of what they have, it really affects you, because then you realize, oh boy, I'm quite lucky. And I've heard your dad say that there's, we feel so entitled and privileged, but when you come to a country where the little means so much and whatever is given is not taken for granted, that really wakes you up to thinking, boy, there needs to be a lot being done here, and I should actually count my blessings. So I think caring is a two-way street, wherein you feel that you have a responsibility for other people because it really eats, it gnaws at your heart that there's something missing there that you can actually help out with. And secondly, you become more caring to yourself and other people by thinking, okay, maybe I shouldn't be as spoiled or demanding or entitled, because I actually should count my blessings as well. So I think it's a two-way street, and it comes from this gut feel that you have when things are not right and that you want to respond.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that so much.
I'll tell you what, we are about out of time, but before we close, please share with us some thoughts on how we can bring character back into our culture.
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, and every day there's a new answer to that. But Richard and Matt, I think we just have to be, as Gandhi used to say, we just have to be the change we seek. We have to really have this, this unbridled power of example, and that's a daily thing, right? I mean, we're
Right.
not perfect. We can lead, and every day is a constant struggle to be the best version of ourselves. But I feel that if you do that, in my experience, at least for the small circle that I have, is that tends to bring people more together. And when you bring people together and you have the same values, you can do a lot. And from that experience, imagine if other people were to do that as well, wherein they become the best versions of themselves, not rely too much on other people or the government or anything else except their God-given abilities, and help other people. We could be in for a nice, happy revolution.
Yep. That's a great way to put it. And that's also a great conclusion to this show. Quintin Pastrana, thank you for being on Character in Action today. It was an honor and a privilege to speak with you.
Matt and Richard, the privilege is mine, and thank you again for your listeners, and thank you.
Thank you so much.
Character in Action is a co-production of the Truth Network and the 7 Degrees of Change Foundation. Your host is me, Matthew J. Norcross. Our producers are Robbie Dillmore and Richard Shannon, and our intro is done by Robbie Dillmore. If you like the show, please listen to and follow us wherever you get your podcasts. New episodes are posted every Sunday. Thank you for listening, and always remember, everyone can be a phoenix.